If you've never spent time alone in the woods, it's hard to explain what the silence really feels like. Most people assume the danger is obvious. Wild animals, getting lost, maybe another hunter who mistakes you for something else. But those aren't the things that stay with you. Those aren't the things that follow you home. The real danger is quieter than that. It's the moment when the woods stop feeling empty and start feeling aware. I grew up in northern Pennsylvania, in a town where hunting wasn't just a hobby, it was part of life. By the time I was 12, I was already walking through the woods with my dad before sunrise, learning how to move without making noise, how to read the ground like a map. By the time I was 23, I was going out alone without thinking twice. I trusted the woods because I believed I understood them, and that belief is what made what happened later so much worse. It was late archery season in November of 2021, and there had been a light snowfall the night before. Just enough to leave clean tracks in the dirt, the kind of conditions hunters hope for. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land owned by an older man my dad knew from work. The property stretched across about 70 acres of thick forest, broken up by a small clearing and an old logging trail. There was also an abandoned hunting cabin deeper in the woods, but no one used it anymore. The roof had started to collapse, and people avoided it without really explaining why. I had been on that land a few times before and never saw another person. That morning, I arrived around 5015, well before sunrise. It was still completely dark when I parked my truck by the rusted gate and started walking in with my headlamp. The beam of light only showed what was directly in front of me, leaving everything else swallowed by darkness. Not long after stepping into the woods, I felt something I couldn't immediately explain. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a shift in awareness, like my body had noticed something before my mind had caught up. I stopped walking and listened, expecting to hear something that would explain the feeling, but there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no distant movement, just silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence you expect in the early morning. It felt heavier than that, almost unnatural, like the entire forest had been muted. I stood there for a few seconds longer than I should have, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Being alone in the woods before daylight can play tricks on you, and I had felt uneasy before on other hunts. So I ignored it and kept walking. My stand was set up about 20 feet high in an old oak tree overlooking a narrow stretch of woods where deer often passed through. I climbed up, settled in, and turned off my headlamp. Slowly, the darkness began to fade into a dull gray as the sun started to rise. The woods came back to life in small ways. Distant birds, the faint movement of branches. But something still felt off, like the balance hadn't fully returned. For about an hour, nothing unusual happened. Then I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. About 60 yards away, slightly downhill from where I was sitting, there was another tree stand. At first, I didn't question it. My brain accepted it as part of the environment, the same way it accepts a tree or a rock without thinking. But after a few seconds, something about it didn't sit right. I had hunted this exact spot before, and I knew the layout well. That stand had not been there the last time I came out. It was a cheap metal ladder stand, the kind that looks like it's been left out in the weather for years. The metal was dull, slightly rusted, and the seat looked worn. It didn't look new, which made it even more confusing. If it had been there for a long time, I would have noticed it. I was certain of that. What bothered me more than the stand itself was what was beneath it. The snow around the base was mostly untouched, except for a single line of footprints leading straight to the ladder. Just one trail, coming from deeper in the woods. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, expecting to see another set of tracks leading away from it. There weren't any. The prints stopped right at the base of the stand. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe I just couldn't see the return tracks from where I was sitting, or maybe the snow had shifted in a way that covered them. But even as I thought that, I knew it didn't make sense. The prints were clear and deep, and if someone had walked away, there should have been some sign of it. I kept watching the stand, waiting for something to happen that would make everything feel normal again. Around 8:30, I saw movement near the tree. At first, I assumed it was a deer, but then it stood upright. It was a person. He was standing partially behind a tree, close to the ladder stand, just enough that I could see him clearly. He wasn't dressed like a hunter. There was no camouflage, no blaze orange vest, Nothing that suggested he belonged there. He wore a dirty gray hoodie and dark pants, and he wasn't moving the way someone normally would in the woods. He wasn't scanning the area or shifting his weight. He was completely still. And he was looking directly at me. For a moment, I thought maybe he couldn't see me. I was high up, partially covered by branches, and staying still. But then he slowly raised his arm and waved. It wasn't a friendly gesture or a casual acknowledgement. It felt deliberate, like he was making sure I knew he saw me. I hesitated before giving a small wave back. It was automatic, the kind of response you give when you're trying to keep things normal, even when they don't feel that way. He held the wave for a moment longer than expected, then stepped behind the tree. I waited for him to come out the other side, but he didn't. I kept watching, expecting to hear something. Footsteps, branches snapping, anything. But the woods stayed completely silent. After nearly a minute, I started to feel uneasy again. Even if he had walked away quietly, I should have heard something, or at least seen movement. Around 10:00, I climbed down from my stand. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the feeling in my chest said otherwise. As soon as my boots hit the ground, the woods felt different. It was hard to explain, but everything felt closer, tighter, like the space around me had shrunk. I walked toward the tree where I had seen him. Each step sounded louder than it should have, the crunch of snow echoing more than usual. When I reached the spot, I stopped immediately. The snow around the tree was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints, no marks, nothing to suggest anyone had been standing there. The only tracks were mine, leading in. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew what I had seen earlier. I knew there had been someone there. But the evidence in front of me said otherwise, and that disconnect is what made the fear start to settle in. Instead of leaving, I turned and followed the single line of footprints leading to the ladder stand. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was walking towards something I shouldn't be. The tracks were clear, made by boots, and they led straight to the base of the stand. When I got there, they stopped completely. I looked up at the seat. It still had a thin layer of snow on it, untouched and smooth. There was no sign that anyone had climbed up or sat there recently. The footprints ended, and that was it. There was nowhere else they could have gone. That was the moment I realized something was seriously wrong. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt like something was there with me, something I couldn't see but couldn't ignore either. As I walked back toward my stand, I noticed a strip of orange fabric tied to a branch at eye level. It looked like a piece of a hunting vest, tied tightly into a knot. I slowed down, studying it, trying to figure out why it was there. A few feet away, I saw another one, then another further down. They weren't random. They were spaced out in a way that felt intentional. I followed them, even though part of me didn't want to. They led deeper into the woods, weaving between trees in a loose pattern. Eventually, I saw something that made me stop completely. A small stick had been pushed into the ground, and hanging from it was a dead squirrel. Its back legs were tied together with wire, suspending it just above the snow. It hadn't been eaten or scavenged. It had been placed there deliberately. Underneath it, someone had drawn a rough circle in the snow. As I looked around, I noticed more of them. Another animal, then another, each one hung the same way, each one placed along the path marked by the orange cloth. It didn't look like something done for hunting or survival. It looked like something else entirely, something deliberate and controlled. That was the moment the fear stopped feeling like a passing thought and started feeling real. Not the kind of fear that makes you panic, but the kind that settles into your chest and stays there. I realized I wasn't just alone in the woods anymore. And whatever was out there had been there long before I arrived. After that moment in the woods, something inside me shifted. I didn't leave right away, even though I knew I should have. Instead, I went back to my stand, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation for everything I had seen. A person living illegally on the property, someone messing with hunters, maybe someone unstable. That explanation should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Because none of it explained the footprints that started and stopped. None of it explained how someone could stand in plain sight and then leave no trace at all. By midday, I went back to my truck to eat and take a break. Sitting inside felt like stepping out of a pressure zone. For a few minutes, I let myself breathe normally again. I replayed everything in my head, trying to organize it into something logical. The stand, the man, the orange strips, the animals, it all felt connected, but I couldn't see how. Eventually, I told myself I was letting paranoia take over. That the woods were just messing with my perception. That I had misread something simple and turned it into something bigger. That thought was enough to convince me to go back out. When I returned to the woods, the atmosphere had changed slightly. The light was lower, the shadows longer, and everything felt quieter in a more focused way, like the forest was narrowing its attention. I climbed back into my stand, but I no longer felt like I was observing the woods. It felt like I was being observed inside them. About an hour before sunset, I heard footsteps again. This time, there was no confusion. They were behind me, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to an animal. I turned carefully, expecting to see another hunter or maybe someone passing through. Instead, I saw him again. He was closer than before, standing about 30 yards away, partially exposed between two trees. I could see him clearly now. His gray hoodie was worn and stained, hanging loosely on his frame. His face looked wrong in a way I couldn't immediately explain. Pale skin, uneven beard growth, eyes fixed directly on me without blinking. And then there was the smile. Slight, controlled, and completely out of place. It didn't look natural. It looked practiced. In his hand was something I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was just a stick, but then I saw the metal handle, yellow and black. A screwdriver. It didn't belong in that environment. It didn't belong in his hand. But the way he held it made it feel intentional, like it wasn't just a tool, but something he was aware of using. We stood there for a long time without moving. I tried to speak, asking if he had permission to be on the property. My voice didn't sound steady. It sounded thin, like it didn't carry the way it normally should. He didn't respond. Not with words, not with gestures, nothing. He just stared at me, holding that same faint smile. Then, without warning, he turned around and walked away into the trees. No rush. No hesitation. Just a calm, steady walk, like he knew exactly where he was going. And that was worse than if he had run. I stayed where I was for a moment, expecting something else to happen, expecting him to reappear or make a sound or do anything that made sense. But nothing came. Eventually, I climbed down and started heading back toward my truck because the light was fading fast and I didn't want to be in the woods after dark. That's when I noticed the orange strips again. They weren't just hanging randomly anymore. They were positioned more deliberately now, closer together, forming a subtle direction through the trees. At first, I tried to ignore them and keep walking straight, but the pattern was impossible not to notice. They weren't just marking trees anymore. They were guiding movement inward. As I followed the general direction back, I started seeing more disturbing signs. A stick driven into the ground with a dead squirrel hanging from it, its body suspended carefully rather than dropped. Beneath it, a rough circle had been drawn in the snow. A few steps later, another marker appeared. Then another animal, a rabbit this time. Then a crow, each one placed in a similar way, none of them scavenged or naturally killed. All positioned deliberately along the same invisible path. The feeling that I was being guided stopped being subtle at that point. It became obvious. Something was laying out a route through the woods, and I was following it whether I wanted to or not. About 100 yards from my truck, I stopped completely. Something was leaning against a tree ahead. At first, I couldn't recognize it because my brain refused to process it immediately. Then it clicked and my stomach dropped. It was my backpack, the one I had left in my tree stand. I didn't move for a few seconds. I just stared at it, trying to understand how it had gotten there. Slowly, I approached it, and that's when I saw the zipper was open. Everything inside had been removed and laid out in the snow in a clean, deliberate line. My knife, my flashlight, my arrows, everything arranged with precision, like someone had taken inventory of my belongings. That was the moment I understood something important had happened while I wasn't paying attention. Someone had been in my stand. Someone had been close enough to watch me without being seen. Someone had taken the time to go through my gear while I was still in the woods. I didn't think about it any longer after that. I grabbed everything quickly, shoved it back into the bag, and started moving fast toward the clearing. The forest felt different now. Not just quiet or tense, but aware in a way that made every step feel like I was being measured. Every sound felt louder than it should have. Every shadow felt like it had weight. When I finally reached the edge of the woods and saw my truck, I felt a brief moment of relief. It lasted only a second, because the driver's side door was open. I stopped walking again. I knew I had locked it. I always locked it. That wasn't something I ever forgot. Slowly, I approached the vehicle. Nothing inside looked stolen, nothing seemed damaged, but something had changed. My registration papers, which I always kept in the glove box, were now sitting on the passenger seat. I didn't touch anything at first. I just stood there, staring at the interior, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I got in quickly, locked the doors, started the engine, and put the truck in gear. And before I drove away, I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. He was there, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching. And this time, he wasn't waving. He was pointing directly at me. Then he slowly dragged his finger across his throat and smiled. That was the last thing I saw before I drove out of there as fast as I could. After I left that property, I told myself it was over. I tried to convince myself that whatever I had seen was tied to that specific place, that it couldn't follow me anywhere else. I stopped thinking about it during the day, but at night it kept coming back in fragments. The footprints that started and stopped. The man standing still behind the tree. The way nothing added up even when I tried to force it into something logical. Eventually, I stopped talking about it altogether. Months passed like that. Normal life slowly returned on the surface, but something about the way I looked at the woods changed permanently. I stopped trusting silence. I stopped trusting stillness. And I stopped going alone. Then I went on a hunting trip with my grandfather in Texas, and everything I had been trying to bury came back at once. The property was large and remote, surrounded by thick tree lines that stretched far beyond what you could see from the clearing. There was an old house in the middle of the land, used as a place to stay during trips. When we arrived, everything felt normal at first. Quiet, open, almost peaceful in a way that made me uncomfortable because it felt too familiar. That same kind of silence was there again, the kind I had felt before I even understood what it meant. I noticed it early the next morning while we were sitting in a blind overlooking a wide clearing. I was scanning the tree line with binoculars when I saw something at the edge of the woods, a shape standing partially behind a tree. At first I thought it was a trick of light or shadow, but when I focused on it, it didn't disappear. It stayed exactly where it was. Watching. I told my grandfather, but when he looked, he didn't see anything. He dismissed it, saying it was probably just an animal or a shadow moving with the wind. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't, because I recognized the feeling immediately. The same presence, the same stillness, the same awareness. Later that day, we shot a deer. It dropped cleanly in the clearing, and for a while, everything felt normal again. We dragged it back to the house and left it hanging while we went into town for supplies. When we returned, the body had been damaged in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't eaten properly. It wasn't torn apart in a natural pattern. It looked interrupted, like something had started and stopped multiple times, leaving uneven damage that didn't match any predator I knew. My grandfather thought it was coyotes. I didn't. That night, we went out with flashlights and rifles to check the area. As we moved closer to the tree line, the atmosphere changed. The same silence I had experienced before returned, heavy and unnatural. We stood there scanning the darkness, listening for movement. That's when I saw it again. Not clearly, but enough to recognize the shape shifting just behind the trees. The moment I focused on it, it disappeared. My grandfather told me to stay back and moved into the woods alone. For a few minutes, everything went silent. Then a gunshot echoed through the trees. When I reached him, he was standing over a coyote. He said it had acted strangely aggressive, not like a normal animal. But even as he spoke, it didn't feel resolved. It felt incomplete, like the explanation didn't cover everything we had just experienced. Then we heard the scream. At first, it sounded distant, like a call echoing through the woods. But as it continued, it changed. It stretched and warped into something that sounded almost human, but not fully. It was as if something was trying to imitate a human voice, but didn't understand it properly. It wasn't a cry of pain. It wasn't a warning. It sounded like repetition. Like something learning how to make the sound. We didn't stay to investigate. We started running back toward the house immediately. As we moved, I could hear something behind us. Heavy footsteps moving fast through the trees. Not random. Not stumbling. Controlled. Intentional. There was also breathing now, loud enough that it didn't feel like it belonged to something trying to hide anymore. When we reached the house, we slammed the door shut and locked everything we could. The sound outside didn't stop. It moved around the structure, circling slowly at first, then faster, scratching against the walls. Testing the weak points. The scream came again, this time much closer, right outside the door. It didn't sound like it was coming from a distance anymore. It sounded like it was right there with us. My grandfather fired through the door. There was a sudden reaction from outside. A sharp, distorted scream that broke into something more animalistic before fading into the trees. Then everything went quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. It felt temporary, like something had simply retreated to reset. We called the police, but when they arrived, there was nothing they could really work with. No clear tracks. No physical evidence that explained what we experienced. They treated it like a possible animal encounter, maybe a false alarm, but even they seemed uneasy with the area afterward. We tried to move on from it after that, but I couldn't, because I started noticing something worse. The feeling didn't stay in Texas. It followed me home. At first, it was small things. The sense of being watched when I was alone outside. The feeling that something was just out of sight when I turned around too quickly. Then one night, I woke up in the middle of the dark for no reason. The house was completely silent, but something felt wrong immediately. I lay there for a moment listening until I heard it. Breathing, not inside the room, outside the window. I stayed still for a long time, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Wind, pipes, anything normal, but the breathing didn't stop. It stayed steady, slow, and close enough that it didn't feel like it was outside at all. Eventually, I turned my head toward the window. At first, I saw nothing but darkness reflecting back at me. Then my eyes adjusted slightly, and I saw a shape standing just beyond the glass. A human outline, still, close, and then it moved slightly. Enough for me to see the face, pale, expressionless, and smiling. That same smile, the one from the woods. It didn't wave. It didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching, as if it had been there long before I noticed it. In that moment, something clicked into place that I had been avoiding from the beginning. It had never been tied to a single property. It had never been random. It had been learning me, not just watching, but studying. Watching how I reacted to silence, how I responded to movement, how I behaved when I thought I was alone. The woods weren't where it started. The woods were just where I first noticed it, because out there I was easier to isolate, easier to predict, easier to understand. And now it no longer needed the woods, because it already knew everything it needed. I didn't move for the rest of the night. I just stayed there, watching the window back, until eventually, sometime before sunrise, it was gone. No sound, no movement, no trace that it had ever been there, but that didn't make it better. Because absence didn't feel like escape anymore. It felt like delay. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't hunt alone. I don't ignore silence when it feels wrong. And I never answer when I think I hear someone calling for help in the dark. Because I've already heard what it sounds like when it tries to sound like us. And I know now that whatever it is, it doesn't forget. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet enough that I can hear my own thoughts, I still notice it. Not moving. Not speaking. Just breathing. Somewhere close enough that I know it's still there, waiting.